Hello, North Carolina, and welcome to Weed the People, a very special live edition of the podcast dedicated to the changes coming movement to legalize cannabis and psychedelics in this great state. Joining me live remotely today is Mr. Mike Morgan, Democratic governor candidate and a former Supreme Court justice member with years of experience on the bench. Mr. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us, and welcome.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And it is an honor to be speaking with you as well. My initial question for you in regards to North Carolina, and I would ask this of anyone that was running for governor, given the gerrymandering that we've been dealing with in this state, the maps that seem to end up in court every year, especially as we've had more Republican control in the NCGA with the ability to override a governor's veto with the supermajority. How do you see that challenge as far as someone who is running for governor, if elected? How do you plan to step into an arena, so to say, where the control is all on the other side? How do you plan to bring a sense of balance and justice back to our government and legislative process in North Carolina?
First of all, being elected governor as a Democrat would mean to me that there will be other Democrats who would likewise be elected during the same cycle as well. So if I'm successful in running and becoming governor, I am confident that other Democrats would have been elected to the legislature as well. So there will be a different climate in the legislature in that regard. But certainly there would be, although still nonetheless a more pleasant opportunity for me as governor to work with a legislature, however it's composed. Still, there will be a significant Republican presence, obviously, in the legislature. But I'm confident in terms of what I've been able to do in my 44 years of governmental experience, 34 years on the benches of North Carolina, 4 different judgeships being encompassed in that 34 years, more judgeships than anyone has occupied in the history of the state of North Carolina. I'm accustomed to understanding that we do have a vibrant two-party system in this state now. I have worked across the aisle, figuratively speaking, with those on the Supreme Court who happen to have a different political orientation than I do. 5 Republicans, I being one of 2 Democrats at the time I left the court a few months ago. So I know that I can work with anyone in terms of making sure that the business of the state gets properly performed and can reach across the aisle, make sure that we understand that there is more that unites us than divides us as we move this state forward in our respective elective positions. So I'm confident, regardless of what the legislature may look like, that I as governor can help to propel this state forward with others in the legislature who might have differences with my philosophies, but nonetheless, we can find common ground.
That's great to hear, sir. Thank you for that answer to that. My next question for you involves more of the changes coming movement stance on cannabis legalization in North Carolina. In 2018, obviously, North Carolina decided to go with their own version of the Farm Bill instead of going with the federal Farm Bill, which allowed for hemp producers in the state to start selling CBD products, Delta 8 products, and now THCA products. But in regards to cannabis in itself, in 2022, President Biden issued a federal pardon for all nonviolent cannabis offenders in excess of 10,000 people. Now, during that speech, he did encourage state leaders and governors to take his side and issue pardons for nonviolent cannabis offenders as well. And we did not see any movement on Governor Roy Cooper's part to do so, even though he said in a speech that he was in support of the president's stance. If elected governor in North Carolina, prior to or after the legalization of cannabis with the passing of things like Senate Bill 3, if it ever gets out of the House and the NCGA, would that be something as governor that you would look at considering?
I would consider certainly the fact that the president has taken a position as he has,
Mhm.
and we'll certainly look at that as being a factor. when it comes to any pardons of the nature that he has addressed. I would emphasize that whenever a pardon is given to anyone, it's based not on one sole factor, but a number of factors that may relate to that particular individual. To make sure that that individual is indeed entitled to a pardon. So while I would not give a blanket response to how that would operate with me, it would certainly be a factor, understanding that the head of our country has recommended it, has performed in a way that's consistent with that. So I would take a very cautious approach, but also a very open-minded approach.
And as of December of this year, 24 states have legalized cannabis for adult use, despite it remaining federally legal. As a former North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice, what is your stance on cannabis legalization, both on the state and the federal level? Are you in favor of states, for lack of a better term, taking the reins into their own hands and passing legalization that would allow for a substance to be sold both medically and for adult use in a world where the item that we're referring to is still federally illegal?
Well, I wouldn't be speaking as a former Supreme Court justice. I'd be speaking more on my own personal terms and certainly as a candidate for governor. And in that respect, I would recognize that, first of all, I believe that individual states do reserve the right to be able to determine what is legal and what is illegal, irrespective of what the federal laws may say. There are similarities and differences in state and federal laws all the time when it comes to criminalization of certain kinds of behaviors. So I do believe that North Carolina can reserve to it whether or not to declare that possession of marijuana is legal or not. I do recognize as well that possession of marijuana, that is simple possession of marijuana, that being possession for personal use, is at the lowest level of our criminal offenses. So certainly it is recognized already in North Carolina that simple possession of marijuana is not a terribly egregious offense. And so in looking at how we should operate moving forward with legalization of marijuana having taken place in other states in our union, I would certainly keep an open mind in terms of how we should look at this in North Carolina, talking to the appropriate officials, most notably district attorneys across our state, law enforcement across our state, determining what it is that we should be concentrating on to make sure that we are not relaxing our laws too much, that we are not making sure that we still do have a systematic appropriateness to our laws. But on the other hand, there is a movement that is certainly a strong one throughout the country, and certainly North Carolina should be sensitive to that as well and be progressive as well as mindful and responsible in its outlook on this.
I appreciate that, sir. I also wanted to ask in regards to not just cannabis, but also with psychedelics. With the increase in research over the past 3 years regarding the use specifically of psilocybin as a treatment option for veterans with PTSD, and with North Carolina having the Breakthrough Therapies Act that has made progress in the NCGA, which would create grant programs for the research of using psilocybin in regards to PTSD research with veterans specifically. What is your stance on using anything that would be considered that breakthrough therapies drug, which would include things like psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, anything that has shown progress for dealing with PTSD with veterans specifically? Obviously, the suicide rate for veterans is astronomical, even on a daily basis. And being the son of a Vietnam veteran as well, that exact number escapes me at the moment because I try not to think about it, to be honest, because I know that it increases every day. And it breaks my heart to see people that have given everything for this country be denied something that could help them medically. And what is your personal stance, not just as someone that is running for governor of North Carolina, but just yourself with your experience that you've had, on the bench and just your background? Are you in favor of psychedelic legalization when it comes to medical use for PTSD?
It is indeed heartbreaking, as you know personally yourself, and I share that feeling as well, that we have veterans who continue to suffer, especially through PTSD, when it comes to still being haunted by certain aspects of service to this country in a combat or other significant way that continues to revisit them and lessens their quality of life. Uh, I certainly do want to make sure that with the veterans in our state, and we certainly do have a very strong veteran population in our state when it comes to the numbers, also a very strong military presence, having more military bases in our state than any other state in the Union. I was born on a military base right in Cherry Point, North Carolina, a Marine base. My father served in the military as well, and I've got other family members. So we all are touched and moved by those that have been and still are in military service to make sure that this country and certainly this state provides all that can be appropriate for them to have a meaningful and enjoyable lifestyle after their military service is completed. When you talk about the usage of psychedelics, that is certainly getting more into the realm of science and particularly medical science. I certainly am in favor of doing all that we can to explore through medication, through the experts, again, looking at our law enforcement and district attorneys to make sure that we are doing all that we can responsibly on one hand, but also humanistically on the other hand, to make sure that when it comes to medicine and treatment and the ability to eliminate, hopefully, and certainly at least ameliorate or soften the blow of PTSD to our veterans, I would certainly want to fully explore that. And again, keep an open mind that with the right controls and with the right situations, that certainly something like this is plausible, but we do need to move deliberately and to move responsibly.
Thank you, sir. And I wanted to ask in regards to that topic, we've seen an increase in hospitalizations and incidents that have occurred in North Carolina, the last one taking place less than a week ago, where 3 school children were taken off a bus that was heading to school in the Cape Fear area and taken to Cape Fear Medical for ingesting edibles on the school bus that were products that were bought in a gas station, just over the counter. WRAL, for example, 3 weeks ago, did a news story with Delta 9 Analytical, which is a local lab in Raleigh that I have worked closely with as well, where there were 3 different products or more that were purchased over the counter in Cary and then taken to the lab to be tested. And none of them tested for anything that was on the label, and they all tested over what the federal 0.3% dry weight of THC is allowed. So we have products that are being sold in the state right now that aren't what they're labeled as. They're highly dangerous to the people that ingest them. Some of them contain heavy metals, some of them contain other illicit substances that aren't listed on the packaging at all. And it's a gray area when it comes to the regulations in the hemp industry with those products. With House Bill 563, which would regulate the hemp industry and the kratom industry in North Carolina, as someone who would be elected governor, is that a bill that you would be favorable to sign into law once it passes your desk?
I certainly give it strong consideration. The fact is that we've got to improve regulation. And once you let the genie out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. So now that we understand that matters have been moving extremely fast in this area. And we've got to be mindful of the fact that indeed, as other states are looking at this, the federal government is looking at this, regulation of an industry that has arrived is appropriate. We can't bury our heads in the sand and feel as though we don't want to face the fact that the hemp industry is here, that we do have CBD that is here, And do we just ignore it and let there be somewhat of a black market or somewhat of an underbelly of society that deals with this? Or do we as a state acknowledge that it's here, and therefore let's try to regulate in a safe way that which can be regulated, albeit some don't want to see the state be involved, because when you start to regulate, there is an admission, therefore, that you are in the business of recognizing specifically and formally that the matter exists. But I'm all for realism, I'm all for practicality. And so, with a bill such as the one you've mentioned, which would recognize state government's ability and indeed need to get involved in regulation, I certainly would be open to entertaining it. Again, there's the need to make sure that we move in a fast moving area of our society right now. Move deliberately, move responsibly, move practically, but at the same time, also have an open mind to the fact that now that it's here, we've got to deal with it in a way that is certainly appropriate.
I appreciate that, sir. And that's exactly the answer that I was hoping to hear, is because I know that this is an industry that, while it is unfamiliar to a lot of people and still has a number of negative connotations and assumptions attached to it, especially with an older generation like we have in the NCGA, there are a number of people, elected officials, that and I hate to say this because it feels like I'm not taking a punch at them, so to say, but they feel like Reefer Madness is still a documentary and not, a satirical piece of work. There are people that still have the same mentality that we had back in the 60s and 70s when it comes to these substances. And with North Carolina, the future that I see, and a future that I have heard in watching other interviews that you've done, you share as well, is I think of the rural areas in North Carolina. I think of all of the places that have been suffering economically, and those are a lot of the same areas that we're seeing massive amounts of fentanyl and other illicit drugs get trafficked through, sadly. So I feel when it comes to rural North Carolina, I know that we need jobs. I know that we need an economic boost for that area. Is the cannabis industry in North Carolina something that you feel could be that economic boost for those rural areas, given the farmland that we have there, even if it's not outdoor grows, even if it's a combination of outdoor and indoor grows or vertically integrated greenhouses that are all enclosed? Is that something that you see would be an economic boost for rural North Carolina, given the fact that, looking at other states that have legalized, the cannabis industry is over $1 billion industry per year for some places?
I thought about that quite a bit and am looking at ways to introduce that formally into my presentations. The fact is that, as I have emphasized rural North Carolina, I thought about our farmers. And the fact is, we really have not replaced tobacco as the cash crop of North Carolina after matters developed with tobacco and tobacco settlements and so forth. But our farmers have still been reeling from not having tobacco as an opportunity for a main staple of North Carolina agriculture to come forward. And we really have been scrambling as an economy in North Carolina when it comes to our agrarian economy to try to find what is appropriate. Now, again, you're absolutely correct, Mr. Suttle, that the fact is we do have those of the senior range, and I'm certainly in that age category that we sometimes look with a jaundiced eye and say, this is too much. This has been historically illegal. And so now, as a result, we're just not comfortable with it. But the fact is, not only in the areas about which you and I have talked prior to talking about the farmland approach, but when you look at the fact holistically that if you have a regulated area and recognize the fact that marijuana can, in some circumstances, be medically appropriate, can be as well a matter for our farmers to perhaps stimulate the economy in that way. We've got to move responsibly, no doubt about that, and have the kinds of regulations in terms of making sure that if there is a sanction to allow marijuana to be grown, what are going to be the guidelines for that? What are going to be the regulations for that? How is the Department of Agriculture going to be involved in terms of making sure that there is compliance appropriately? But again, being open-minded about it, there's a difference between being closed-minded about it and being open-minded about it with practicality and understanding reality. And so I certainly would look at rural North Carolina, particularly our farmers, as being able to, under appropriate circumstances, uh, growers recognized to be certified to be growers of marijuana, with certain guidelines being put in place as we look at that prospect.
Absolutely. Now, I wanted to thank you for sharing your stance on cannabis and psychedelics with us. And while that is something that the Change is Coming movement is focused on entirely, there will be a number of people that will be watching this interview through different social media later on. And a lot of them are undecided voters in North Carolina. So if you'd like, sir, I'd like to take what time we have left. And I collected a number of questions from those undecided voters. And I'd like to go ahead and ask those to you now, if you're agreeable to that.
That's fine.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. So this question comes from Melissa Hoffman in Garner, North Carolina. Mr. Morgan, NC is currently ranked 34th in the nation for teacher pay and 46th for starting teacher pay. If elected, what would you do as governor to give teachers in North Carolina a better financial future?
But teachers deserve a raise. I've talked about that repeatedly in my campaign appearances. Education is my number one priority. I've listed that, I've been consistent with that, and I continue to feel that way. And a part of making education my number one priority as I campaign for governor is the fact that we need to reward our teachers in their selfless way in which they dedicate themselves to the young people of our state, to educate our youngsters, our precious children, to make sure that they can be all that they can be. But we've got to stop insulting our teachers in the process. In the most recent budget, teachers got a measly 7% raise. And even with that, that had to be divided 4% one year, 3% the next year. The fact is, we need to get our teachers' salary pay up. I'm committed to that, to make sure that our teachers are recognized, that they are appreciated, and that they are exalted in the way that they should be. And so I am for making sure that as governor, we make sure that in the budget, we reward our teachers appropriately for the fine work that they do. They are dedicated to their craft. And I would make sure, again, with it being the number one priority of mine anyway, that teachers are well compensated and appropriately compensated for what they do.
Thank you, sir. This next question comes from Chantel Richardson in Durham. The decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade marks an unfathomable abandonment of pregnant persons' fundamental rights to privacy and bodily autonomy. If elected, what would you do to make North Carolina a safe state again for women who believe in the right to choose?
I don't believe that government should be involved in medical issues such as those where a woman is determining, along with her doctor, what is best in terms of her health, in terms of what is best for her body, in making those kinds of determinations. So I believe that government intrusion in those kinds of decisions is wrong. That should be a personal choice between a woman and her doctor. And if we have a female who is still of tender years, not being of adult age, then one who is appropriate to help advise that individual, be it a parent, be it a guardian, to be involved in that as well, in terms of that decision-making aspect. But the bottom line is government should not intrude in health decisions. And I do see such a determination by a woman, a female, to be a health decision. And with that, government has no place in that.
And thank you, sir. This next question comes from Mike Willard, a recent graduate of UNC Chapel Hill. For many years in North Carolina, the American dream of home ownership has turned into a financially unobtainable nightmare for many. What is your plan to ensure affordable housing remains an option in North Carolina and the idea of home ownership as the American dream doesn't have to die with the next generation?
Well, state government has to be responsible. Also, local government has to be responsible. And we do have options that are involved here in terms of making sure that those that are being pushed out because of the fact that uh, property taxes are becoming too high, the fact that mortgage rates are rising and themselves becoming unaffordable and unsustainable for those who are attempting to own homes to be able to afford. We can find ways through appropriate financing, through incentives, through making sure that local governments work in such a way that there are uh, areas of towns and cities, and that there are properties that are going to be devoted to affordable housing. Not every house has to be a mansion. We can look at tiny homes, for example, and other variations of tiny homes, with affordability being the primary motivation to make sure that ultimately we have homes that are affordable, that are available, that are that can be financed in a way that we can have incentives that are given to those that are financial lenders, those that are involved in being able to get certain kinds of credits to help those with home ownership. There are ways to make this happen. The legislature has not been as forthcoming because the legislature by and large feels as though these are the kinds of matters that should be left to the free market. But the fact is, the free market often leaves folks behind. And if we're going to talk about the American dream, we need to make that dream available for any and everybody to the fullest extent possible. And so we can explore ways that this legislature has not seen fit to do and make sure that we can make affordable housing a reality once again for more people in North Carolina.
Thank you, sir. This next question comes from Stephen Hart of Greenville, North Carolina. And Mr. Hart asked, if elected, how would you address the drastic rise in violent crime, school shootings, and gun violence seen this year in cities like Durham and Fayetteville?
We've got to be more responsible. The fact is that we do have laws that are available, but we've got to be more methodical and more intentional about those laws. Red flag laws, background checks, waiting periods, all of those can come into play and strengthened when it comes to curbing gun violence. The availability of firearms is far too easy in this state and in this country. None of us is safe as a result of this. And there are those that want to make this a Second Amendment issue and say that the right to bear arms, which is a constitutional recognition, is somehow being threatened when we talk about having responsible gun ownership focuses. I was on the bench 34 years. I know a little something about the Second Amendment. This is not about the right to bear arms. This is about the right to bear arms responsibly and to have those to be borne by those who are qualified and permitted to have them. So there are ways to make us all safer. And while there are those that, again, want to hide behind and beneath the Second Amendment, we just need to be bold enough to understand that it's not a Second Amendment issue, it's a safety issue. And we need to go forward and make sure that those that have guns have them responsibly. There's no need for assault rifles. Assault weapons are weapons of destruction. They are war instruments. So we've got to make sure that we're doing better. We can do better. And with me as governor, we will do better.
Wonderful, sir. The next question I had for you isn't from one of the undecided voters, but it's one of those Murphy's Law moments where, you know, the second I schedule an interview, something will come up in the news the day after I have already, you know, submitted questions and things like that. I was looking on WRAL after we spoke the first time, and I saw the story where Governor Cooper and Josh Stein made the announcement on WRAL during his press conference about how the NCGA has historically made it difficult for Black voters in North Carolina to be represented. Now, obviously, that is a statement that is true, you know, based on when you look at the maps and everything like that. But being both from the same party and having the governor and Josh Stein being the ones to announce that at the press conference, as someone who would be, if elected, historically the first African-American governor that we have had in North Carolina, which is a, you know, tremendous moment, and it shows us moving forward as a state when it comes to the diversity in our in our legislator and our governing process. What was your feeling seeing that press conference and seeing Josh Stein and Governor Cooper as, you know, one of the African American candidates for governor, was someone from your same party taking that stance during the press conference instead of looking to you for advice, you know, as someone who is running for governor as well?
Well, my primary opponent in this race has been endorsed by the governor and the sitting governor currently, and that violates Democratic Party principles when it comes to the fact that those that are Democratic Party officials and those that are Democratic officials elected in government are not to be involved in primary politics. But my primary opponent has actively solicited the current governor to help his cause to become the next governor. So I'm not surprised that I would be ignored in this kind of discussion. But the fact is that there is a need to understand that this legislature certainly has been involved in voter suppression, and that voter suppression has included having it to be more difficult for African American or Black voters to be heard. It's needless to have a voter ID. And there are those that would argue that, well, if you've got to use an ID to do banking business and to negotiate bank instruments and have access to places where you've got to show who you are, then certainly to vote would be something else that should require an ID requirement. But the fact is that all of those situations that involve the demonstration of showing who you are depends upon the fact that you're demonstrating and proving who you are where such proof is absolutely needed. We don't have any meaningful data to suggest that people need to show their IDs in order to vote, because it's been negligible that there has been fraud involved in voting. There are some that would want you to believe that, but the fact is that the data is paltry and very negligible about this. So voter suppression is real when it comes to voter ID, when it comes to redistricting, in terms of diluting people's votes. And while certainly as one who has ruled in those matters, I wrote the dissenting opinion for the state Supreme Court when it came to voter ID. When it comes to being able to consult and know someone who's been in public service as long as I have, someone that would have something meaningful to contribute. But again, in this political race going for governor, I'm not surprised one bit that once again, my opponent, as well as his staunchest cheerleader, the governor of our state, would ignore me and pretend that this uh, candidacy of mine is not worth recognizing, and that I am not worth recognizing as one who can contribute to make sure that matters are better in this area for all North Carolinians. But I press forward, continue to talk about these issues as a viable candidate for governor. And in becoming governor, I make sure that I use this wisdom accumulated across decades to make sure that we have a fair and proper playing field for everyone.
And thank you, sir. And when you speak about your opponent on the Democratic side, looking at the other side of the aisle, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, obviously a controversial figure, has made a number of statements from time to time that I had to double check and read twice to make sure that that was actually what he really said, because I was wondering if it was a fever dream when I first wake up and check the news and be like, oh, nope, that's real. That happened. Most recently during his speech in the NCGA, where he all but called down religious righteous vengeance against members of his own party that did not support him as the Republican candidate for governor. And now we look at the other side where we have yourself, and then there is Josh Stein also, having the nod from the sitting governor, Roy Cooper, to kind of put him, forward and say, this is the person that I'm endorsing, and pushing for other Democrats to realize that. What is your opinion? Because I honestly am just curious, as someone who has the background that you have and has been involved in, the state politics and state judicial system for so long. What do you feel about Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson? Do you feel like this is something that could possibly actually happen? I mean, obviously, we've seen a lot of things in the state happen in the past couple of years in regards to Republican control. But when I think about North Carolina, I honestly don't want to imagine a North Carolina that I wake up in where someone like Mark Robinson is governor.
It's a frightening proposition. If Mark Robinson is elected governor of North Carolina, it would be a travesty for our state and for our nation. The fact is that a Mark Robinson governorship would set North Carolina and its people back generations, because we're starting to hear the same kinds of rhetoric in terms of hatred, uh, in terms of division, in terms of negativity, the stoking, the riling of emotions to have us to be pitted against one another. There's more that unites us as a people than divide us. And yet Mark Robinson and those that support him would look at and try to appeal to the worst in us instead of trying to make us all better as we live together in this world. Leaders lift people up. They don't tear people down. And you and I don't have time to talk about just how many things have been said by the current lieutenant governor, now running for governor, that are just eyebrow raising, eye popping, but then absolutely abysmal and embarrassing. They're disgusting, they're inappropriate, they have no place in a responsible, mature society. But yet there are those that support him, and I look forward to meeting him in November. I am the one who is involved in this race on the Democratic side that has the best opportunity to defeat Mark Robinson. And I can take much of what he says and absorb that, turn it around and appropriately address it, and take it wherever he wants to go, face to face, toe to toe, head to head, and absolutely make sure that people in North Carolina understand that that kind of destructive, demeaning, disgusting rhetoric has no place. My opponent on the Democratic side is just trying to ride that wave and just try to cruise without really confronting the circumstances. But I'm talking about it head on. And say to those North Carolinians who will vote in the Democratic primary that I need to get beyond March to get to November to defeat Mark Robinson. But once I do that, I am confident that I'll make sure that I address everything appropriately and help people to understand in North Carolina they need not fear a Mark Robinson governor position with him being in the governor's mansion if I'm the nominee to be on the Democratic ticket to run for governor.
And thank you, sir, for taking the time today to answer the questions from undecided voters in North Carolina and also to share your overall stance on cannabis and psychedelics in regards to our state. Before we finish this call, I'd like to give you the opportunity. What is the overall message that you would like to send to the voters that will be viewing this on social media later? North Carolina has seen so much changes, good and bad, in the past 3 to 4 years. And being a Dillon Rule state, we're on an odd year kind of schedule when it comes to only being able to introduce new bills in odd years, the way our election cycle runs. So we're looking at the same people in power that were in power this year, as far as the NCGA being in power in 2024 until the elections are over and then those new seats are filled in 2025. What is the message that you would like to send to people? Where do you see North Carolina going based on where we've been and where we are now? And why should they look to you as the leader that can get us to a better future than the one we currently are looking at?
I'm convinced that North Carolina's best years are ahead of it. It's just a matter of making sure that the right person is in place to help to facilitate North Carolina being all that it can be, and that its people become all that they can be. I'm running primarily because I want to restore the hopes and dreams of all North Carolinians because we've not had a level playing field for everybody. There are those in that very legislature that you mentioned that are picking winners and losers among us. And those of us that are left on the loser side are left to battle for the crumbs, and we're the ones that are fighting each other because there's this divide and conquer mechanism that is existing. The fact is that my attitude is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that everybody can achieve if we are making sure that folks are understanding that they can be free to fulfill their own destinies as long as they are putting one foot in front of the other, making sure that they're living lawful lives, but making sure that in achieving all that they want to, that they can be all that they can be. I'm from a rural southeastern town in North Carolina. I've beat a lot of odds along the way to be where I've been blessed to be able to come. And I understand that there are those that the odds defeat and they get pushed along the wayside. We've got to treat people not as statistics, but treat people as individuals who are allowed to be all that they can be. And that's why I'm presenting myself in this way. I'm the best qualified to be governor. I'm the most electable to become governor. Indeed, when I last ran statewide, I had the widest margin of victory when it comes to voter percentage of anyone who was on the ballot statewide that year. That year was 2016. And as a result of that, I know how to win. I know how to govern. I know how to lead. And so I'm offering myself because I want to make North Carolina the best it can be. I love North Carolina, and I want to offer myself to the people to allow me to be the next governor of this great state.
Well, thank you so much, sir. I did have one personal question that I'd like to ask you because you just mentioned the race in 2016. When you were running with the Supreme Court, Barack Obama endorsed you as his pick for candidate and saying that this is the person that deserves to be in this position. Even though he is not the president now, still obviously his opinion carries a lot of weight when it comes to Democratic voters. Is he someone that you would reach out to during this race to see if he would give you the same nod, but this time for governor?
I would certainly welcome our former president, whom I greatly admire, to give me that kind of support. I don't expect it. in the Democratic primary, however, because again, as opposed to the governor of our state, it's against the rules to solicit Democratic Party officials or those that are involved in Democratic politics to make those kinds of endorsements. My primary opponent, the Attorney General, has actively sought that from our current governor and others who are Democratic officials. I would not put our former president, President Obama, in that kind of position during a primary because that's just not right to do that. But upon winning the Democratic primary, I would certainly welcome our former president and his support if he'd be willing to give it.
I appreciate you being so candid with your answer. And that is one of the things that I respect about you as a candidate is that you are willing to admit that this is something that you would not do, not because you don't want the support, but because we are still in the primary phase and you know what the rules are. Being someone, given your judicial background, that is exactly how I would expect you to feel is, looking at rules and order and being someone whose whole life has revolved around having to follow rules. That's exactly the answer that I would have expected. And thank you for being so open about that. Ms. Morgan, it has been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you again for taking the time to give us your thoughts on where North Carolina is headed, why you should be the right leader for that. And hopefully with the number of people that will be looking at this interview as we get closer and closer to the primary elections, I'm hoping that the undecided voters, both on the Democratic and Republican side, that there can be a vision that they see looking across the aisle where they know the right choice that needs to be made for North Carolina's future is Mike Morgan. So thank you, sir, for that. Is there anything that you would like to let people know as far as any appearances that you have coming up or any campaign speeches that you will be given where the public can attend? How can people get more involved with the primary campaign on your side?
Well, thank you for that opportunity as well. We do have an active website, morganforgovernor.com. We also have a very active social media, which can be found at Mike Morgan for Governor. And in checking my website and in checking the social media, we do update it and make it apparent where we're going to be in terms of giving speeches and making appearances. And we're traveling throughout the state. So I certainly just ask people to continue to stay in contact with us through those methods, especially with our website. Go and sign up to be a volunteer. Go and sign up as well to receive updates and information. And that's the best way to keep up with what we're doing. We've got a great vibrancy and a great momentum in this race right now. And we're all over the place, going everywhere and doing everything to acquaint people with this candidacy. It is a transformative candidacy, and we're awfully excited about where we're taking this state. So thank you for the opportunity to say those things and to make people aware, Mr. Suttle, of how they can find us and keep up with us.
Absolutely, sir. And again, thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you to all of my listeners and the people watching this on social media as well. I know it's been a while since we've put out an episode of Weed the People, but I knew that this would be one that everyone would be interested in, especially with the primaries being right around the corner next year. There's a lot of movement that's going to be happening between now and the time of those elections. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of you, sir, across North Carolina. I travel a lot with this state as well, given the fact that, it has 100 counties and we are focused when it comes to the changes coming movement in a lot of those areas. So I know exactly how tiring it can be to stay on the road in this state, trying to visit anywhere and everywhere you can. But it's a mission that we choose because the whole point behind my existence with CIC Consultants and doing things like this for the people of North Carolina is to make sure those that have never had a voice before now are allowed to be the loudest voice in the room. And I feel like you share a lot of those same feelings and a lot of that same motivation on your end. So this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again, sir. And as always, to those in North Carolina that are watching, hold fast, North Carolina. Change is coming. We'll talk to you soon.